Another famous hadith, again known to you, but I'm trying to explain them from angles that perhaps are not known, is the hadith also in Bukhari and Muslim. And this hadith is that hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said that the example of the person who recites the Quran, the believer who recites the Quran, okay? مثل المؤمن الذي يقرأ القرآن مثل الأترجة ريحها طيب وطعمها طيب. The example of a believer who recites the Quran, okay, is the example of a citron. It smells very nice and it smells very pleasant, and it also has a beautiful taste as well, okay? So it's got a fruit that has a good taste and also smells very nice. Then he said, as for the believer who does not recite the Quran, he's like a date. How? It has no real scent to it, but it has a very pleasant taste as well, right? It tastes very sweet and nice, but it has no real scent to it, okay? And the example of the hypocrite who recites the Quran is like the example of a rayhana that has a very nice smell, but it doesn't taste very, very nice. And the example of the Munafiq, so the fourth example, the example of the Munafiq who recites the Quran, he's like another fruit he called al-hamdala. He doesn't have a very good scent, and also there's no taste to it. Now the point is, he's talking about 4 categories. And if we think about it, try to break it down intellectually speaking, logically speaking, there's only 4 categories that could be there. You're a believer, you're not a believer. So mu'min and munafiq. Alright? And then each of you could either be reciting the Quran, inshallah all of you are believers and all of you are reciting the Quran. But each of these 2 categories could either be reciting the Quran or they could not be reciting the Quran. So the Prophet ﷺ gave an imagery related to all 4 of these categories. There's a believer who recites the Quran, another believer who doesn't recite the Quran, a munafiq who recites the Quran, another munafiq who doesn't recite the Quran. And then he gave something that was physically tangible to them. They knew all of these, fruits that the Prophet ﷺ gave an example to, right? And the point that he's trying to hit home is that in order for you to be the person who has belief internally and also has manifestations of that belief externally, then you have to collect the quality of belief along with reciting the book of Allah. Now, the question is, what exactly is the reason why Allah's Prophet ﷺ made this simile? Like in the life of a believer, we know that the citron smells very nice and it tastes very nice. But when the believer recites the Quran, it's like smell, because smell kind of exudes and people around can smell. But how does reciting affect people in that same way? Well, by reciting the Quran, you end up causing others to be rewarded. Okay? In addition to you yourself being rewarded, by reciting the Quran, everyone that's around you is also getting reward as well. Because citron, yes, it smells nice, so by itself it's something pleasant. But when the person comes and tries to smell it, that person also feels pleasant by smelling that nice smell, right? Yes. So a reciter of the Quran or a believer who recites the Quran, he himself is nice smelling, that's great. But he's also affecting other people with reward, and that is by them listening to the Quran, they'll also be rewarded as well. So he's affecting society simply by reciting the Quran, right? And you can go ahead and give da'wah to the people even through just reciting of the Quran. Many people, they just hear the melodious tone of the recital of the Quran, and then they end up actually thinking about this particular idea of the Quran. And I remember when I was young, I would go on downtown streets of Toronto to give da'wah to Allah. And sometimes this is what I would do. I would just stand there reciting the Quran. Young and Dundas Street, downtown, if you've ever been to Toronto, you'll know what I'm talking about. That's where everyone has to go to shop or to do whatever they want to do. And subhanAllah, I would actually find many people intrigued by it. So some people would come and say, what is this? What are you reciting? They never heard the Quran. And if you keep it under certain limitation, then you won't get tickets for noise pollution as well. So the point is that, and people get affected. And I've heard, I've even seen cops walking by me looking at me like, what is this person doing? And they can get affected as well, because this is the power of the Quran, right? And I remember one of the times someone took a picture of me and it went in the newspaper, me reciting the Quran. Nobody knew who it was. I was just a 17-year-old kid. But the point is that it can have a real impact, on people, and people end up asking you questions, and people end up crying as well, tearing up in front of you. They don't know what you're reciting, they start crying, because the Quran has that power. That's actually one of the recent theories. It's always been around, people feel it, but one of the recent theories is that one of the angles of the miraculous nature of the Quran is the haymana of the Quran. The ability of the Quran to completely overpower the individual. Right? Sometimes when you listen to the Quran, it ends up putting you in a sort of, excuse my French, a trance. Right? That you can feel. And even sometimes, non-Muslims can also feel this as well. Not at all times, but sometimes. And just like that, not all Muslims will feel it, but some of them will feel a specific spiritual power when they're reciting this Quran, right? And when they're hearing the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So everyone can get affected by this particular Quran. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the ability to be impacted by the Quran. Allahumma ameen ya Rabbi.